I'm here again with one of your favorite guests, Preston Dennett. Preston, welcome.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me on.
Always a pleasure, and thanks for coming back on. So today we are going to cover the various species that have been reported by contactees. And if you find this information valuable or this episode valuable, please hit like and subscribe. And then if you've had any experiences, please feel free to enter it in the comments section. Preston, so you've covered this for what 30 years, 20 years? Probably more like 30 years.
35, actually.
Yeah, so over 30, well over 30 years, kind of pushing on 40. In the accounts that you've seen, do you have a sense for what kind of the characteristics are of the beings that are most often seen by contactees? And then what are the what's the variability? And we go through each of the different potential species that you've seen, because for all I know, they could also just be different manifestations of the same entity. Who knows, right? I don't want to make any presumptions, but from your perspective, what have you seen?
Yeah, well, I've talked to a lot of people who claim to have seen what we would call entities, right? And this is sort of what kept me out of the UFO field, honestly, because I'd heard reports of people who have claimed to have seen aliens. And the reports were all humanoids, human-looking figures. I thought, well, that's very Star Trek-y to me. I don't really believe this. And after I found out that my brother had seen a UFO, my sister-in-law saw grays. My other sister-in-law saw short blue beings, and had a number of friends who had encounters, people at work. This is how I got involved. And I looked into it, and I'm okay, this is a real phenomenon. People are seeing these things, and they are reporting these entities. And I absolutely am convinced that they're not lying, that they are accurately perceiving and reporting these things.
And you know that because there's certain things that are non-public that they mention that are consistent. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And the first time that really hit me hard was when I was interviewing my sister-in-law, my brother's wife, who hadn't read any books on UFOs, and this was at a time when it really wasn't saturating the media like it is today. She had never heard of grays. Grays were not something that was talked about back at that time. And she didn't even really interpret it that way. All she says is, these were not human. I don't know what they were, but they were not human. And I said, well, describe them to me. And I had picked up a few. There was maybe a handful of books at that time describing what we now know of as grays. And she described 5-foot-tall figures wearing olive green jumpsuits with very large, oversized heads, extremely pale skin, huge dark eyes, almost no lips, just a slit for a mouth, very, very small nose, no visible ears. Basically what we know of as grays. And as I began to collect accounts, that's the one that turned up the most. I remember the second one I got vividly was I was talking to a lady at work who I'd worked with for years. And her whole family were seeing UFOs. I'm like, let me talk to them. And I talked to her daughter, and her daughter's like, well, these things came into my room. I'm like, what do you mean? She says, these figures. I'm like, describe them to me. She says, honestly, Preston, I did not get too good of a look at them because they scared the daylights out of me. I'm like, well, just tell me what you saw. She said, well, they were short, very skinny, large, oversized heads, huge dark eyes. I didn't see much more than that. And they said, don't be afraid. We won't hurt you. And next thing she remembers is being inside of a rounded room, and described what I've heard of, many times of, people being physically examined by what we would call grays. So I started to really interview people, and this is what I heard most was grays. And they generally are described very much the same way, as being anywhere from 3 to 4 feet tall, upwards to 5 or 6 feet, but generally 4 feet tall, about. and often wearing tan jumpsuits, perhaps, sometimes silvery, but more often people will say, I'm not even sure they were wearing anything. They don't describe seeing, actual anatomy. So I'm suspecting that this is a skin-tight suit.
Mm-hmm.
But always the dark eyes, always the slit for a mouth. There's always the pale, pale skin, sometimes perhaps slightly bluish or tannish or white or gray, but along those lines. And just this, it's a very specific description. And the more accounts I collected, I would say at least 50 to 70% were what we would call grays. And there's variation. Some will describe smaller, rounder eyes. Some will describe huge, huge wraparound eyes. Some said their eyes were not black necessarily, but particularly on board a craft, there's some indication that these dark eyes could be lenses that they remove. Because many people who are on board the craft say that no, they have bluish eyes, or green eyes even, or light-colored eyes. But the grays is, yes, by far the most common in my files. And I would certainly say that's probably true with most researchers.
Mm-hmm.
There's some disagreement about that. There was a recent study by the Free organization headed by Ray Hernandez, and they did a survey with some thousands of people, and light beings came up, I think, as the number one category. Kind of surprised me because I've only got a few accounts of what I would call glowing, bright white figures. But I do have a few, and those are also reported in humanoid in shape. But people don't get a whole lot of detail because all they're seeing is something you might even interpret as angelic, just a glowing white figure.
In what context do they see these things? Like in their room, outside? Are there any cases when it might just be a different phase of reality? In other words, if they confuse beings that they might see in the astral plane for these beings? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. I don't.
No, almost exclusively in the bedroom. Really, I mean, I don't want to say exclusively because it's on craft and sometimes outside, but no, usually. And this is something that actually really surprised me because I was thinking about this not too long ago. I'm like, where's the most likely place to see an ET? Your bedroom, to be perfectly honest. People are going out there trying to call down UFOs and have contact, when really the most effective place might be to just lay down in your bed and call them in. Because the fact is, this is where most people are seeing what we would think of as extraterrestrials. And they're mostly grays. And when someone's taken on board a craft, that's usually what they will describe. That is the most common type in my experience. And
now with grays, again, in the literature, or maybe even just in the popular conception, are grays actual biological entities or artificial biological entities? I think there's the example I can think of is the Whitley Strieber example of the gray bodies kind of piled like cordwood. So like they're like vehicles to be occupied. What's your view of that, or what does the literature say on that?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Yeah, I think there are different types. There is an AI, artificial intelligence, biological android type being. And these can be differentiated from the others in that they are usually much shorter, 3 feet tall, and emotionless for the most part. And these are the people, as near as I can tell, who scoop people out of their beds often. And then they're taken on board a craft, and they meet a 5 foot tall gray who does have emotions and is a biological being with, odors, body odor, so to speak. Whitley Strieber talked about that. I did a whole research.
The cheese.
Which turns up. People describe it as woodsy or sort of a
cinnamon. Cinnamon's the other one.
Cinnamon odor. Dolly talks about this. I asked her specifically because she's very much awakened to her contact. She doesn't have missing time. She doesn't have fear. I've got a full-length book about just her experiences alone. she's an extraordinary person in terms of having contact.
Can you just, for the audience, can you just mention the book and where they can find it really quickly?
Yeah, it's called Symmetry, A True UFO Adventure. She's had contact since she was a little girl, really woke up to it at age 14. And since then it's the most extensive case I've really had the privilege to investigate. And for that matter, even read about, honestly. There are people who have extensive contact, but a lot of them have recalled this through hypnosis. And she's got multiple eyewitnesses. She's got medical evidence. She's got a lot of photographic evidence. So her case.
Well, she also proved it in real time to you too, right? Because I know sometimes I've gotten pushback where people hear her story and don't believe it. But I know that in your experience, you've been with her physically, and like you've had sightings when she was around. Is that's accurate, right?
Right. So I've been able to vet her story to my satisfaction. Proving it to someone else is another matter, especially if they're, a diehard skeptic. Really, the only way anyone's ever going to know is through personal experience. You can believe all you want, but you don't know anything until you've personally experienced it. So fine, be skeptical. She's not telling her story to convince skeptics anyway. It's more to help people who are experiencing this, or to contribute what she knows. But I asked her about Whitley Strieber's account where he saw them stacked up like cordwood. She said, yes, I have seen that. She says they are biological androids, and this is something I've had a number of people tell me. She was able to provide more detail than others. She's seen them turned off and on, seen them stored away in rooms, and this sort of thing. And those look like Greys, but they're short little guys, but otherwise identical to the descriptions that we hear. But the Greys have the same variation that we have here on Earth in terms of humanity, with very tall people, very skinny people, people with various head shapes and features and so forth, types of hair and skin color. So we see that same variation among Greys, with people describing, almost normal-sized heads, or even some with hair, wispy hair perhaps, but you get a huge variation that's very similar to what we see here on Earth. So
there's one interesting thing that I've had former military remote viewer Dr. David Morehouse on this show several times, and we did cover episodes on remote viewing, alien civilizations, etc. And what he told me, I don't know if it was offline or if it was on the show, but he says that he said, I don't believe in alien civilizations. I know they exist because I've seen them. But one thing he did mention offline, that it was more of a curiosity to him, kind of, or not a curiosity, but an observation. He said in all his time in remote viewing, the one species that he's never seen are Greys. He didn't have a reason for it. He wasn't saying that they don't exist, but it was just a curiosity. So I've never remote viewed them for whatever reason. I don't think he spoke for his colleagues. He was just talking about him personally. Any theories on why that might be? And again, I'm not coming at it from not believing, because if people say that they've seen these things over and over again, I think there's good reason to believe what they're seeing.
Yeah, but I couldn't even venture a guess as to why he particularly hasn't, because most people who been pulled on board a craft or report seeing entities talk to me about some variation of what we would call Greys, for sure.
If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like, subscribe, and notification buttons. Additionally, if you have any feedback, please put something in the comments below. And lastly, if you want to watch the full episode of this clip, you can find it above. Thanks again for watching.